All right, let's give everybody a couple seconds here to get into the webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Budget Sessions, Preparation Steps for 2027. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alex Martin, KWPC partner over at KWPMC, and I'm joined along here with our expert panelists, which I will introduce later. Today's topic is one every board and manager faces every year, budget season. Preparing a strong 2027 budget means planning ahead, understanding reserve needs, right, Matt? Anticipating rising costs and communicating clearly with residents. A few housekeeping notes. This session runs about an hour. The Q&A chat is open, so if you have any questions during the session, please ask. We'll try to get to all the questions or we'll try to address all the questions. Today's content is for informational, educational purposes only. So every community's financial situation is unique. For specific financial, legal, or accounting matters, please consult the appropriate professionals, right? So joining us today, we have Matt, Regional Executive Director from Reserve Advisories, and our one and only Miriam Velasco, Financial Services Controller for KWPMC. Matt, go ahead. Tell me a little about yourself.
Thanks,
Tell us.
Alex. And yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me here today. I'm Matt Queasley, like I said, with Reserve Advisors. I've been doing this a pretty long time, 26 years with the firm. I'm a professional engineer and reserve specialist. Our firm works nationwide, actually in 30 countries, but my focus is Florida. Following the tragic collapse of the Champlain Towers building, got very involved with the lawmakers and the division as well to help implement the changes and hopefully find a balance between regulations and realistic needs for associations. So glad to be here today. Looking forward to talking about reserves and budgeting. I'm also the treasurer at my condo association where I live, so I always learn things at these events too. So thanks again for having me. Looking forward to it.
Thank you for being on, Matt. Miriam, give us a little bit of your background.
So my name is Miriam Velasco. I'm a registered accountant. I am a lifelong property management individual. I come from 25 years with our family business. We owned and operated 750 rental units. And I've been with KWPMC for a little over a year in this controller position. I hope everybody gets something from these webinars that you didn't know before.
Oh, I bet we will. So we have some poll questions we want to ask. Um, we're going to send it out there. Please answer them that we could use this data and then for discussion points. One of the first question is, are you joining us from a condo or HOA? I'd like to see where you live, which 718, 720. Do you have any planning committees that lets you discuss projects to put into the budget for the next calendar year? Love to know if you have any of these committee set up in your associations. And when does your board typically start budget planning? That's a real important one. We'll let everybody answer here. Give you another couple seconds. All right, let's see what the results are. So 63% of you are from condo, 33 from HOAs. Very interesting. Okay. Planning committees, 63% have yes planning committees and 37% no. And 80% 3 months before the fiscal year. And I've done it 1 to 2 months before is 16%. And then 4% is unsure. All right. Matt, let's start with you. What's your board's started doing or be doing as of today?
Yeah, well, this is great. I'm really thrilled that our audience, 80% of our audience starts budget planning 3 months
Yep.
or more in advance. And that's excellent. It's hard to believe that it's already mid-July, but this is the time to start planning for your 2027 budget. This is once you get about halfway through and you start to get your June financials and see what a half year of expenditures is. It's really when most associations start planning the budget. But I like to say, if you can, that there's that part of the bottom of the budget. Usually it's at the very bottom, and it's the reserve schedule. And people often know just how we work. We start from the top down and we do the bottom part last, right? I'm always trying to tell people flip that budget upside down. Do the reserve schedule first because these are items that you don't need 6 months of actuals for. These are long term plans. You need years of actuals to be able to accurately project what's needed, but also you need a reserve study will help you fill in the gaps there. But that doesn't have to wait until this point of the year. So if you've not started on your budget process yet, at least start on that reserve section of the budget so you have that ready to go before you run into the last minute changes on the annual contracts and rate increases that you're seeing from other line items in your budget. These reserve items just don't change that fast. They're 30-year lives, 10-year lives, 5-year lives. It's not a short term of an item. So that's where I would start. I always say start in January. And even now we have some associations that call us and say, we want a reserve study. But a reserve study takes probably 90 days at least to complete properly. And so if you're planning to approve your budget in October, which we would like to, that's not going to give you much time to review your reserve study. So we have a lot of clients that are looking at, scheduling the reserve study for late this year or early next year so that they can have it ready to go by this time next year and be done with that portion of the budget before you get into the real meat of the operating side.
Matt, I just had a board member text me. They asked, why does it take 90 days to do a reserve study?
So part of it is the time of year. I guess I'll say it doesn't always take 90 days, but this time of year,
Mhm.
there's only so many firms that do this. Now we've got a lot more firms now that we have SIRS doing this, but the good firms get booked up. Some firms get booked up much further than us. The smaller firms we have, for us, we average between 60 and 90 days, but it's really just commitments. There's a certain number of experts that we have to do those reports, and they're not standing aside waiting for work, right? We've got work booked out to them. So most of them have a schedule booked for at least the next month or two. And then when we get a new contract that we just fill them first come, first serve. So there is some lead time there. There's also obviously collection gathering time, information prior to the inspection. The site inspection takes time coordinating that. And then actually authoring the report takes time too. So there's quite a few different things there, and that's why it does take a long time. Better to do it right than just do it fast, in our opinion.
Yeah,
Well,
I agree
Miriam,
with that.
Miriam, can you tell us when does KWPMC start the budget process and do that? I mean, I know, but I want you to tell us here and tell everybody who's watching here how the process goes and why it's so important to start so early in the year.
So we've actually already started our budget process. Our budget templates are processed and ready to go. We start to load them as soon as these June financials are actually completed and get them out to our property managers. Even though we release these budget templates sometimes towards the end of July, that is not when we expect our managers and our teams to start thinking of this budget process. Similar to what Matt said, having going through your reserve study and starting to implement those numbers, especially if you at this point you know that they're not going to change for your 2027 contribution. Um, but again, going through your contracts, nothing is your property manager should always in the middle of the summer be going through their contracts and making sure that all of those contracts are in place for 2027, what increases they need to do for those contracts if there's any step ups, and if something needs to be renegotiated, now is the time to get in front of those vendors and renegotiate those contracts. Secondly, we ask our property managers to speak to their board members to really outline what their capital project schedule is going to look like for 2027. How are we going to fund those? Are those reserve items or are they just special projects that we want to do? Do we have a couple of palm trees? Because as we all know in South Florida, palm trees, especially mature ones, are very expensive that we need to replace. Where is that going to come from? Um, But those are the conversations that need to be had before we start putting numbers down to paper. What's the project? What's the big picture? What's the road look like of what we want our associations to look like at the end of 2026 and especially at the end of 2027.
Yeah, that's why it's so important in your action plan that every property that, that action plan includes the reserve study, and that creates your roadmap for success, right? So you can start executing, and that's your 2, 5, 3, 4, 5 year plan, right? It's so important to put it all together here. And a lot of people miss that because and then what happens is that you get a lot of budget problems that are avoidable, right? Can
Right.
you share, Miriam, a couple of the problems that you see out there that associations do, common mistakes?
So I see a lot of, for example, cameras and technology are really, things
Hmm.
that change all the time. And you want to make sure your association has the best and the most current. But let's say you have a camera system as part of your uh, building and you
Hmm.
want to replace it. Okay, perfect. It's a reserve item. It's in my reserve study. I'm going to use reserve funds. But if you're taking your camera system from 4 cameras to 40 cameras, guess what? That's not going to be covered in your reserve system. So you need to make sure that you know that only the system that you have, that replacement cost is included in your reserve study. But whatever you're going to put in new, that's an operating expense. And some people don't get into they think, oh, it's in my reserve study. Yeah, no, it doesn't work that way. And again, when Matt and I were preparing for this webinar, we talked about it. We don't see a lot of landscaping in condominium reserve studies. And some of these things can be very expensive to replace. I saw an association recently had a $60,000 just hedge removal on that they had to flow through their operating budget because it's not a reserve item. But and they had automatically assumed it was part of their reserves. So making again the understanding and knowing what is considered an operating expense and what is considered a reserve expense is really a conversation that needs to be had with all board members. No assuming of anything. Don't assume that it's in your reserve study. Don't assume that you can use your reserve funds for that. Always assume that it's an operating expense, and then we'll get into less trouble that way.
That's a good point. Matt, we have a question here. Can you explain what a reserve study is and what is the difference between operating and reserves? And so some individuals here want to have a better understanding what a reserve study is.
Absolutely. And yeah, Miriam, you hit on an important topic. You don't want to double dip. You don't want to have something in both categories that should be, but you certainly don't want to have any gaps. And so that the reserve study is a projection of capital repairs and replacements. It identifies the components that are reserves, which is the biggest hurdle and obstacle, is just like Miriam said, do we have landscaping on there? Do we not? Identifies the components that you're reserving for, their useful life, their remaining useful life, and their replacement cost. So you have a projection of expenses of what you can expect. Florida Administrative Code says reserves are for capital expenditures or deferred maintenance of existing assets, essentially. So, like Miriam said, an improvement would not meet the definition of a reserve component. And then the reserve schedule is going to give you funding requirements. So, how much do we need to set aside each month to ensure that our reserves are adequate to fund those repairs and replacements and to build up a reserve that meets the needs equivalent to the liabilities?
Excellent. Thank you, Matt.
And
Miriam,
just out of just
go
wanted to
ahead.
add something, and making sure that those components are carefully delineated and everything that you know is going to be part of your reserve study is a huge, huge win on your reserve study. Again, something else, Alex, talking about another question of some things that I've seen a lot are omissions. Nobody's perfect. A reserve study may miss something that could be a significant factor. And you know what? If it's not in there, you can't use reserve funds.
Yeah.
So that's important.
Yeah, here's how it usually happens for us. Like we might suggest, yes, landscaping, and Larry has a question I see in the question and answer too. Like landscaping is something we see, and the reserve provider might say, yes, we think would be a good idea to put a reserve for this on in there. But it's not required. So HOAs, homeowners associations, don't have to reserve for anything that they haven't opted into reserving for, right? So that they don't have to by statute. They can. But so your reserve provider might recommend something, but the board can say, you know what, we don't have to reserve for that. Our fees are a little bit higher than we want them to be. Let's take that out of the reserve study so that it lowers the funding that's needed.
And that becomes a
Anything
business decision.
it does, but you recognize that, and Miriam's exactly right. You have to have a really clear, um, concise list of explicit reserve items of what is included. Is that hedge included? Was that part of the reserve schedule that you planned on? And for a condo, anything now, it's anything under $25,000 or 25,675 because they update the number now each year with inflation, doesn't statutorily have to be reserved for. So your camera situation, each camera is less than 25,000. So it's a board could say, yeah, we don't have to reserve for it by statute, but if we're not reserving for it by statute, we need to replace it. It needs to go, we need to have it come from somewhere else. I do occasionally see associations put in like a capital improvement fund. Miriam, I don't know if you've seen that too, like maybe separate
Not
from the
very much.
operating budget. Yeah, it's kind of rare, but that might be an option if you wanted to do an expansion of your system or add a component, add an amenity or something of that nature is an option. But to answer Larry's question here, since we have it, yeah, if landscaping is not included in your reserve study, we can certainly add it. And a lot of times, going back to my story of the boards that would say take that out, take that out. The next board comes in and wants to do the project, says put that back in, put that back in. So each time we update, we're kind of playing this game of, well, we can put it in. It's landscaping is discretionary for the most part to put in your reserve study. I think it's a great practice, best practice. But if a board wants to make that business decision and they go back and forth, well, then the reserve funding is going to kind of go back and forth each time we update it, and that can be a problem. But so nonetheless, Larry, yes, the answer is yes. You can ask this to add the landscaping back in if it's not in there now, and it should be, and you'd like it to be.
And in answering another one of the questions, I saw somebody said, once an improvement is done, is that automatically updated into your reserve study? I'm like, not unless you ask for a reserve study update. I always specify to my boards that once you're done with a large capital project, that is exactly the moment when you need to redo your reserve study because you need to update the useful life of those components that you um, were able to improve or replace. And you need to make sure that every new portion that you put in is included in your reserve study at that point.
You do, because Larry has that question here. If landscape is not currently your reserve study, can you ask just to be added?
Yes. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And
Yep.
Joseph's asking same kind of question. Joseph's asking here is if an item such as landscape is not included in the reserve study, can we use the money in the reserve to pay for a major landscaping job?
If it's not in the reserve study, no. If it's not listed as a component, then you cannot use reserve funds.
Without prior approval of the membership, right?
Oh,
Because there is the ability to get a vote of the members to use reserves for their other purposes. So sometimes boards will get that approval and say, we've got some money in our roads that we didn't spend or we want to borrow from. We want to rob Peter to pay Paul. They can get the members, the majority of the voting interests, I think, to vote to move those funds. And Joseph, one caveat. I know we had a number of quite a few HOAs on the call as well, based on the poll. Homeowners associations, some homeowners associations might have reserves that would be considered non-statutory, and those reserves aren't really restricted, so the funds can be kind of used at the board's discretion there. In my experience, but I always we're kind of getting into legal territory, so it's always a good idea to confirm with your attorney before you, if you have a question like that, because it's always easier to identify that with a quick legal response and have that documented response on hand before you go spend the money and end up with a claim, and then we have to go through a lot more work on the back end. So get that kind of buttoned up before you'd go and take your reserve money and spend it on a landscaping job that may not be part of the reserve schedule.
Okay, great. So Michael has a question here for both of you. Once an improvement is done, does a reserve study get updated for that improvement, i.e., 4 cameras to 20 cameras?
so like I said before, whenever a association does any large capital improvement project, that's the moment when you need to update your reserve study. So no, it's not automatic. You need to actually contract your reserve study provider to actually physically update your reports.
Okay, thank you. So what are you seeing out in the market now? Are you seeing cost increases or decreases in insurance, the labor market, contracts? What trends are you seeing out there?
So we see the insurance costs are actually pretty flat to a little down in the last couple of years.
Okay.
We don't see those huge increases that we saw a few years back. Again, that is going to be very dependent on weather for us here in the Florida market. Also, with regards to the labor market, I'm telling you, the labor market is very tight. The especially and wages are increasing. South Florida has become a very expensive place to live and work. So we have to make sure that we are providing a livable wage to our employees at the association level. So that
We're also
needs to be
seeing,
accounted to for.
yep, agree 100%. And we're in addition to that, the labor increases are probably the biggest factor in construction cost increases right now. But in addition to that, petroleum prices are up. The price at the gas pumps up. A lot of our products, roofing and siding and other materials are petroleum based. Even transporting those materials, so the materials are also continuing to
Asphalt as well,
escalate.
right?
Yeah, asphalts. Yeah, mostly petroleum products. So, but even something like a pump, just getting it from where it's manufactured to the building is costing more, right? And that's a combination of factors. But yeah, so the materials are increasing along with that. But yeah, thank goodness we are seeing a little bit of a softer insurance market to help offset some of that. But this is reality, and I think that's one of the key themes I'd like to get across to all of our board members here is that it's not your fault personally that those costs are going up, but it is the reality, and I think you have a responsibility to reflect that to your members. No one likes that. I hate that to tell my neighbors that their fees are going up, but I think it's really you really have to be responsible to be transparent upon what it truly costs to live in the building or in the community.
Yeah, and I think there's a natural want of board members to keep fees as low as they possibly can, and they're just doing a real disservice to the long-term needs of the property. You can only not fund for so long before it becomes a snowball effect. So I think we have to be mindful when we talk about those things. Also, I really wanted to make sure that I brought up we need to be looking at not only our expenses, but also our collections as we do these budget processes. Do we have a large AR balance? Is that going to be 100% collectible? Have we really dived in to make sure that our allowance for doubtful accounts or our reserves against non-collection of fees is adequate, and that needs to be done as part of the budget process. And sometimes that's not necessarily intuitive or natural to be done at that time.
That's great. I have a question here. So for Matt, if a building replaces their HVAC unit or cooling tower, and they had it in their budget, they had a 30-year expiration on it to replace that, but they ended up replacing it in 21 years. How does that work in the financial world? Because they did it 9 years early. Was that because lack of preventive maintenance? It didn't last the specs, or what happened there that they had to replace their systems 9 years early?
I mean, yeah, it could be a number of factors that cause that to happen.
Hmm.
We're seeing more and more manufacturers build in planned obsolescence to their parts, so it's they find it's a better business model. I'll pick on you used air conditioner. I pick on elevators a little bit here because they figured out they used to build elevators that lasted 80 years. There's still some like elevators in Chicago from the 20s that I'm familiar with that are still, operating.
Yeah.
But the manufacturers realize, that's not a very great business model if I can only do business with the building once every 80 years. So I want to make sure I'm doing these a little more frequently. So we're just seeing technology and the technology, the type of materials that are used, the type of equipment that's used, just things are lasting a shorter life. Could be preventative maintenance. That being said, it could be original workmanship. It could be, extreme, weather event, got hit by a storm. Like there, it's hard to say what causes those things sometimes. And we could certainly, do an investigation on it. But I think the important thing to do is how's the board going to react? And again, it's not the board's fault likely that it didn't, unless they ignored maintenance or something. It's not their fault that it failed when it did. It's how do we react? Can we, pay for it out of our reserved funds? If we have reserved funds available, if it's a pooled reserve, maybe we can do that. But as Marion suggested, once you make that change and spend something that maybe you weren't anticipating sooner, or even later, or more or less, then go back to the reserve schedule. Say, okay, what impacts does this have on next year's budget, so that we can adjust the incoming funding accordingly, up or down, based on the changes that we've made, based on what we know today, and then learn from that as well. Okay, 21 years on that air conditioning equipment, that means the next one's probably not going to last 30 years either, right? Unless we can track it back to, like I said, some storm event or preventative maintenance issue. But we're constantly learning about how long those pieces of equipment last, and it continues to shrink in most cases, the useful lives of a lot of that type of equipment.
And Matt, piggybacking on something that you just said, you know, well, a reserve study gives us funding guidelines where we want to be at the end of a certain fiscal year. And so if you overspend, meaning not only if something was a shorter useful life, but maybe something the reserve study estimated was going to cost $80,000, but at that moment the price of fuel is through the roof and it cost $160,000, then that needs to be compensated for. So because we're trying to meet these benchmarks at the end of every year in terms of funding.
Right. So there's this balance, right? And Mike Pinato has a question in the Q&A. I can address it here too. How often should a reserve study be updated? Well, the state statute for structural integrity reserve studies, which is really the only type of reserve study that's required by statute, says it should be updated every 10 years. Well, that's really a long time in your estimating financial planning projection in the projection world. So our industry generally recommends an update every 3 years. So at least every 3 years, doing a visual inspection and an update of the reserve study. But many, many communities, especially with the fluctuations and the spikes in costs, labor, materials, storms have played a big factor in this, are actually updating it essentially annually or every other year, because there is a need to reset those items, now that we have mandatory funding and just a lot more eyes on what we're doing with the reserves. And by eyes, I'm talking about potential third parties. I'm talking about the DBPR and the division. We want to make sure that we are staying true to what the true needs are. And so that our budget is reflecting what the current information is, not what the information was 2 or 3 years ago. So I hesitate to say, in all cases you should update every year. That's really probably overkill, but there certainly are cases where updates might be needed, at least 3 year interval, perhaps sooner.
Yeah, so I was also reading in some of the questions and I saw a question that came, other than landscaping, is there something that we don't see often from the excluded from the reserve studies? And I will see personally what I've seen is that we'll see a lot of docks and seawalls omitted from reserve studies. It just some people don't
Good
point
point.
it out to their reserve advisor when they're doing their reserve study and they just get omitted. And then now you're 3 or 5 years, and when you're doing an update, you're really just updating what's already there. So I've seen that be omitted from reserve studies, landscaping, and anything technology. And maybe that's because of the threshold with 25,000 and 10,000, but really your servers and computer projects on these large condominium associations have gates and those kind of things. I don't see a lot of technology being addressed in reserve studies.
Historically, I think concrete restoration's been overlooked significantly in a lot of reserve studies, but I think we're getting better at that. But I
I
think
think
that,
that
yeah,
one's been addressed.
yeah.
So how are you when you're doing these reserve studies? How are you budgeting for the increases? I know COVID was a different time and things, the cost just blew up, but what is the average cost increase you should be putting on a reserve study for an HVAC component? When you do the study, do you already know what the cost is going to be 25 years from now? Or is this something you got to every year just kind of increase per inflation and everything that's going on and adjust daily? There's a question here that I think that's the question you were trying to ask.
Yeah,
I,
yeah, no, good question, and we really look at today's dollars as best we can. Try to figure out, what would be the cost of equipment to replace in that like kind today, and yes, of course, it's quite a bit more than it was 3 years ago, or maybe the last time you replaced it. But what is the cost today? And then we tend to apply a nominal inflation rate, and different providers have different approaches on this, but ours is to take a nominal rate, and I'll tell you how we get the rate in a minute, but the nominal rate and just apply it to all of the components annually over the next 30 years. So it's kind of a crude assumption, a basic assumption, but it's just we're going to take a rate, and the rate is typically equivalent to the last 30 years, right? So we do a 30-year projection forward. And so we said, well, certainly there's going to be spikes in inflation. There's probably going to be years where inflation is less than average, but on the last 30 years, construction inflation, so this is different than cost of living, but more related to the producer price index. And even more so, we have data related specifically to different types of construction, kind of ranges from like just under 3.5% to close to 4% historically over the last 30 years. So we take that number, that again nominal rate, and we apply it to today's cost, and so that generally means like in 20 years that cost is going to be twice as what it is today. But that's again going back to one of the reasons to update. We don't have a crystal ball, we don't have a way to predict exactly what inflation is going to do, and so it's important to continue to dial that in as actuals become reality.
yeah, that's why it's important to look at those numbers yearly, right, Miriam?
Well,
I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
want
or at
Ideally,
least
yeah.
every, yeah, at least every few years, yes.
Yeah, I'm a big believer every year when you're looking at budget, look at your reserves, look at costs, look at oil prices, look at all, and you got to adjust accordingly because so you don't get caught off guard.
Yeah.
Because I've learned in a lot of properties we take, they don't look at this reserve study for 3 to 5 years and
Well, they
increases
look at the funding requirements.
the funding requirements, but they don't actually look at the actual line items and the cost for those line items. So you're still using costs from 1990, right? And it's 2020, from 2001, and you're not going to buy an HVAC unit and elevator at that price anymore.
No. And I think it's one thing that you brought up, our reserve studies are minimum guidelines. There's nothing stopping you from putting more money into your reserves if you can. But these are just the minimum guidelines that will put you in a place to have the funds to replace these capital component items when they're required to um, be replaced. I saw a question about pooled versus non-pooled.
Yep.
I think so in the past the trend was to have line item reserves. When you have line item reserves, those funds are strictly limited to that component. So for example, if you have a reserve line item for paint, and guess what? Your HVAC goes bad, can't use those paint funds for your HVAC. Um, but pooled reserves, whether SIRS or general, they're usually held in different pools, uh, does allow some flexibility in what you can use those funds for, even if they haven't met their useful life, if they haven't, if they've exceeded their useful life, if they've underperformed their useful life. So I always recommend pooled reserves as the better option for associations to have more flexibility to cover the needs as they occur.
Excellent.
Consistent with what we're seeing too, and generally allows for a little bit lower funding level too. If the increases are an issue, pooled reserves can get there. But pooled reserves allow us to take into consideration, back to your prior point, Miriam, about the minimum standards. You can have a pooled reserve that is targeting baseline funding, which is targeting running out of money at some point. Essentially, it's targeting zero. So your pooled reserves has a cash flow. Some years you have a little more cash, but then eventually some year you spend on your biggest project usually, or when you have a series of projects, your reserves are at their lowest point. We call that your critical or threshold point. And if that balance is zero, then there's no
You're
cushion.
good.
There's no cushion, and that's the minimum standard, is to at least have zero. And you're right, you're good because you've covered all your projects. You'll build the reserve back up from there, and you haven't gone into the red. But most associations will want to still build a little bit of a factor of safety in on their pooled reserves, whether that's a threshold amount, dollar amount, or a percent funded. I think that was one of the questions, and we're getting a lot of great questions. Thanks, everyone. I don't know that we'll have time to get to, but I'll try to hit them as we're talking about these. The question about the percentage of fully funded that should be targeted for the reserves. I don't typically key in on that. Some associations need to be 100% funded or even more, while other associations hover around 20 or 30%, and they're okay. So it's really more of a dollar amount in that critical year that we want to try to target. And more is better, more is more conservative, but also more is means higher dues. So there's a balance there. So
Yeah, there has
not
to
a
be a
one
good
size
balance
fits
there.
all answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Matt Barry has a question here. Assume the most recent reserve schedule includes components that are less than 25,675 and now wants to remove funds related to the component from reserves. Can such funds be removed from reserves? Must the association continue to reserve from such components since they are in the most recent reserve schedule?
So it depends very much on whether you have pooled reserves or straight line reserves. So if you have a straight line reserve, that reserve funding is tied to that reserve fund, and once you've collected for it, that's earmarked for that item. So even if you removed it for your reserve study, you can't move it or you have to wait till that component breaks and use it on those funds.
Yeah. And
If you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I want to highlight though that you don't, just because, yeah, he highlighted the threshold, 25,675 is this year. That is the maximum amount for which any item above that, I'm sorry, the minimum amount for which any item above that must be in your reserve schedule. You can still reserve for items that are 25,000 or 24,000 or 20,000 if you have a smaller association. So that's honestly, Barry, what I'm seeing most of our associations doing is saying, let's leave these items in the reserve study. Depending on the size of our association, a $15,000 project is a significant project to us still. So we're just going to leave that in the schedule and treat that as we always have. There's nothing wrong with using a lower threshold, and so that's typically what I'm seeing. Sorry to interrupt, Miriam, but
No, and then if you have pooled reserves, that those funds are just going to be attributed to another pooled component. Because really once they're in the reserve, they should stay. The funds, once the money is in the reserve, it should stay in the reserve for any item that is in your reserve study.
Great. Miriam, there's a question here. Stacy, what about capital projects that have been initiated, i.e. contract executed in the permitting phase? How should the study be updated? What do we
Well,
do here?
if these are non-reserve projects, meaning you're doing a new capital improvement project, then complete the project and re-update your reserve study. If these are reserve projects, meaning that the component was already in your reserve study, then you just can submit that information to your reserve advisor, or reserve provider, and they will or can update your study on that component if it was just one singular component. Again, if this is a large capital improvement project, I always recommend that is the moment when you need to update your reserve study. A lot of things have changed. A lot of useful lives have been extended or um, changed. So yeah, that's the moment to redo your reserve study. But once you've completed the project, not when you're in the building or permitting phase.
Matt, there's a question here from Larry. Is it illegal to use protocol non-statutory reserves to fund new capital construction not listed as a component?
I'm not an attorney, but I would say, I mean, yes, the statute clearly states,
Yeah,
and again, if it's statutory reserves, right? Homeowners associations that don't have statutory reserves may not have these same requirements, but if the statute clearly states the reserves and any interest accruing thereon can only be used for their intended purpose unless approved in advance by a majority of the voting interests.
great. There's a question here that came in. It says, what can owners do if boards is not addressing SIRS project priorities, but instead focusing on other items, bundling them to be able to access reserve funding?
Well, that's being able to understand what is considered a component in
Right.
your reserve fund. So, for example, if you have, let's say, elevators are technically non-SIRS, um, and you have elevators included in your reserve study, they're going to be a component of your general reserve study. W- If you have a cab replenishment compared to a mechanical improvement of the elevator, just understanding that those two components are listed separately and they need to be addressed separately. So for if you're not addressing, that's the importance of in a condominium association, also having your SIRS and general reserves completely separate. So for example, your elevator repair is part of your general reserves. That's not going to touch your SIRS funding. Your SIRS funding will be there for those components. Um, but you know, without getting more into more detail, I can't really say, are they doing those reserves are separate. So it really one has no effect on the other if you're in a condominium association.
My advice would be get involved, ask the questions, get on it, ask the board to form a committee to review these reserve expenses. Like this is great that you are paying attention. That's what we all should do as members of our communities and if you're on the board, but if you're saying your board is not addressing SIRS project priorities, that statement on itself concerns me quite a bit.
Same.
But I think there likely is a reason, right? There of course there are bad actors in this state out there, but I deal with boards all the time, and a majority, vast majority, 99.99% are all trying to do what makes the most sense for their association. They may have other information that you haven't seen or they haven't shared enough, but ask the questions. And be part of the conversation to help steer the community in the right direction. There may be a very valid reason for what's happening in the community. And Miriam's right. It is critical to understand what's going on there. So get involved and keep asking the questions. There is there. I hesitate to even say it, but there is a way to file. The division gets all kinds of complaints, and there's ways to file complaints on your boards. But before you do that, just see if you can get some more information. See if you can understand their thinking behind the projects, because likely they're in my experience they don't have any malicious intent with that.
Yeah, and some service projects do take a longer planning time. So maybe they're in the planning process and you're just not seeing the action items yet. But a little bit benefit of the doubt uh is that
Yeah, go to the board meetings, ask questions, develop a committee, communicate, make sure you get into community. I think asking questions most of the time you'll get the answers just by sitting and asking the questions. Um, Somebody has a question, is how do you list the pooled reserves in your reserve schedule on the budget notice? We used to list items, and now they just see a pool reserve. They don't actually see the items.
So what I have suggested for our property managers to do is to include the component list from their reserve study in the budget mail out. So for example, pooled SIRS include these components and we are funding to these components. The same with general. General reserves include these components and that's what we're attaching. So the pool is covering this list of components.
Furthermore, I would suggest including the list of the components, the useful life, the remaining useful life, and the cost of each component too. Those are technically required disclosures on the administrative code. So yeah, it really important to list the line items, but even the useful lives and replacement cost data should be part of that budget, a reserve schedule that goes out with your budget too.
And I do find that most reserve studies do include a listing of this, just like that said, component, useful life. cost.
Rick has a statement here. He says, "Be careful with Band-Aid repairs throughout the year and thinking the budget was correct when in fact it's not a real fix. It's based on Band-Aid repairs, right?" So I've also noticed this in some other area where they fix something. It's a Band-Aid repair. They use a reserve money, but it's an actual replacement, right? It's not, and then they restart the process all over again here, the lifespan. Can you talk a little about what are you seeing out there? These Band-Aid repairs are no bueno.
Yeah, and it usually comes when dollars are tight and the board's faced with difficult decisions, right? The
Yeah.
roof starts leaking, and the reserves aren't there to replace the roof because the previous boards weren't great stewards and they didn't set up the reserves as they should be. The board has kind of three options. They can try to special assess the members, which are extraordinarily unpopular. They can borrow money to repair or replace the roof, which that has an additional cost with it. And some communities may or may not be eligible to borrow money. And so they end up with the third option, which is kind of do nothing or push the project off. And all of those, end up being more expensive in the long run. So again, it's difficult
Yeah.
messaging sometimes for your members to understand. But if you're really have their best interest at heart, if you're really being a fiduciary of the community, you're going to go ahead and make one of the more difficult decisions of special assessing or increasing annual assessments to pay for that project in lieu of the Band-Aid repair.
Yeah, I'll tell you a real life story. We took over a building and they've been doing Band-Aid repairs to the roof for a very long time. And the savings was never there because insurance increased them for not repairing the roofs and completely redoing the roofs and would not cover them anymore. So they were paying the difference just on the insurance side, which made no sense because also, if I've noticed that insurance has dropped their lifespan of roofs, right? We went from like 25 years to 20 years. I think recently
8.
8 years, you're seeing?
I saw 8 the other day. I was like, whoa.
Unbelievable. That does sound right.
I
Like,
guess it
really?
becomes on the type of roof that it
Correct.
is. But I was like, what roof doesn't last more than 8 years?
That's not a good
Yeah,
roof. Don't buy it.
yeah.
You're gonna pay for
Well,
the 8-year roof.
yeah, I mean, I think that was maybe a symptom of the insurance companies being very, very picky and wanting to depopulate and
Yeah.
not and insure less properties, and it was a way for them to get out of some older properties that they were concerned about insuring when the market was very hard. Now that the market's softened, we're seeing them being a little
More
more
flexibility.
lenient, a little more flexibility on the light roof lives.
Um, Wendy has a question here. Is part of the cabins an electrical portion? Do you separate both on the I think Wendy, what you're trying to ask is, do you separate both on the reserve study, cabins versus electrical?
Yes, we typically do. There'd be separate line items, but
Okay.
I don't see either as being SIRS items. I mean, I think there's maybe some discretion there. I mean, there are some electrical components. There's also mechanical components, but I don't look at elevators as the electrical system that was being referenced by the legislature when they did that. So generally, they're non-SIRS. But yes, the cab finishes probably have a different useful life than the doors, than the hoist equipment, and then the mainframe, the controls also might have a separate. So there may be multiple line items related to your elevators, each with different timings and costs. Sometimes you do them all at once, makes sense in some cases. Other cases you might do those in more of a phased manner.
So
Miriam,
I
right.
see a question, sorry, from Lisa. Are we
Yeah.
covering operating budgets in this session? I think we did at the very beginning in the sense of we talked about making sure at this moment in time, we are looking at all of our contracts, making sure to renegotiate everything we can. We've talked about payroll and labor costs and how we need to make sure that our employees have a livable wage, especially in South Florida. And we also talked about special projects that are not reserve items, meaning things that our board members have asked us to prioritize for calendar years and making sure that we are covering those items. But I think the operating portion of our budgets, it's pretty tick or tack. We're looking at the same expenses year over year, life after life. So that's why we're not going into more specific detail on those things.
Good. Jose has a state. He wants to say citizens upon renewal refused unless re-roofed. 15 years life. We had a warranty for 20 years, lost 5 years of value. I know it's
Yeah, we saw
frustrating.
this a lot, and it was
Yeah.
part of citizens trying to depopulate
Yeah, it was.
their
Yeah.
group. So
So there's another question here. What do you see? What's the biggest impact you're seeing on the reserve studies dollar wise this year? Do you see a trend in anything really increasing here?
I see a trend in an overestimation of interest income. So I think when reserve studies were done 3 or 4 years ago, some of these interest income percentages were extremely high for money that was sitting in your accounts, and that has not really come to fruition. And guess what? It needs to make up. It needs to be made up.
yeah, I would agree with that. And the other one I'd say that just the whole exterior envelope concrete restoration type projects, there's so much of that going on that there is very high demand for those projects, and supply and demand means higher costs. So that's a big impact. Even though a lot of communities are getting through that now, or on the other side of it, the ones that haven't are seeing some extraordinarily high impact. And Miriam, you're right. The rates of inflation, I've seen or interest. I've seen some funny studies would do some funny things with inflation as well, where they'll the inflate the contributions at a high level and then inflate the expenses at a low level to kind of manipulate funds. I think those things are catching people off guard if they did that in their initial structural or
Right.
reserve study period. Yeah.
And that delta is real cost.
Yep.
It is real cost. So Randy has a question. Should we be concerned if our reserve provider has a corporate office in northern state and the only Florida office is at a distant Florida city? Should we have a local professional doing the inspection and report?
So I don't know if he might be referring to Reserve Advisors, the firm I work for. It has a corporate office in Wisconsin, and
Oh,
our other physical office is in Tampa. So I would say you shouldn't be concerned. That the key is to work with people that understand the market. Like I said, our firm works with over 3,000 communities in the state, and we're constantly getting data from buildings next door or down the street in the same zip codes as you, and we're collecting that data. So we have a really good handle on what's going on here. We have engineers located in the Tampa area as well as the Orlando area as well as in Southeast Florida. So we
yeah,
pretty well
I,
covered the state. So I wouldn't be too concerned if it's Reserve Advisors that you're referencing there.
yeah, no,
And
I see you guys everywhere.
Yeah.
and again, just as a people issue, do business with people that you find reputable. Do
Yeah.
business with people that you have confidence in and that really do understand what you're going through. So whether it's an accountant, a reserve advisor, an
Mhm.
attorney, or any of the above, or property manager, make sure that you feel comfortable with the person you're doing business with and the what they're providing you.
Excellent, excellent point, Miriam. Yeah, I, I mean, you guys are all over the place, Matt. I see you everywhere. So, um,
Yeah, we're blessed. We're one of the
yeah,
largest in the country.
yeah. What is Miriam? What is the best way to explain a budget increase to residents? What are we advising our boards here? Because you might have a small increase here, a small increase there because of costs rising. What's the best way to communicate this?
I think you need to paint a picture
Yeah.
of of the system as a whole. Meaning, yeah, our expenses went up $3,000, but we're not making as much in income because our rates on our savings accounts and those are not as high. And you just need to paint a complete picture. It's never going to be one thing on the, I hope it's never going to be one thing on your budget that's really, oh, that's why our budget went up 15%. But I think it's more of a holistic approach and looking at it in a big picture. I had a board meeting earlier today where, they really wanted to understand the narrative of what the process is. And I think, as a controller, that's my job to provide as well, this is holistically why your budget is is going up by this amount. Some of it includes an additional contribution to reserves. Some of it is because you underfunded reserves in previous year. Statute allows you to waive the funding of reserves for 2 years if you're going through a milestone inspection or some sort of project. But guess what? Your components don't care. Those 2 years are going to pass. So when you come out of it, you're just going to have to fund those 2 years that you didn't fund because the component doesn't care that you were doing a project on another portion of your building and didn't fund for it. So I think you have to tell the story holistically.
Yeah. And at the core of it, I think is to remind your owners and the job that you're doing to protect their investment in their homes, right? This is a really important asset. And if we understate the cost, then we end up doing the band-aids, or then we end up not qualifying for lending. Projects get deferred, and we maybe cut off the amount of potential buyers that we would have for our units, and the unit's not worth as much. So we're just, you're trying to be realistic. That's kind of what I would say is you're being realistic about the true cost so that you are staying competitive with the market. Look, there's brand new buildings that are getting built that are, state of the art, um, high end amenities and things, and so you need to keep pace with that in order to protect the value of the units. These are sometimes $100 million businesses that your board is running, and you don't think about that sometimes, but think about all the units in your building and how much each unit is worth, and you're dealing with sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property, and it takes some difficult and strong business judgment, which might mean increases. But I think Miriam's right. Just being transparent as possible is critical.
I think Matt, you said a statement earlier in this webinar that really means if you're not funding your association and its needs correctly, then you're just robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Mhm.
Because ultimately it's all going to come to fruition.
It always does. Miriam, there's a question. I know we have 4 minutes left here, and I want to give you guys some time to um, give your final statements. When KWPC prepares a draft of a proposed budget, do you include an attachment schedule of the current estimated remaining useful life and replacement cost of all reserve components as
So
required?
as a as a controller, I do not, but I asked the property to do that. They are the people who maintain those reserve studies. Again, like I said a bit earlier, I've found that most of these reserve studies do include a one-page sheet that lists all the components, the useful life, the cost, replacement cost, all that's necessary for that to be sent out to your homeowners. We just attach it to the budget as part of what's making up those pooled reserves.
Matt, there's a question here. Do you see a lot of people underfunding their reserves compared to the replacement value? It looks like, are you seeing a lot of this where they're just keeping it strategically low, underfunding that when costs have risen?
Yes, yes, because it is uncomfortable. And oftentimes I just get the response, and I think we've seen at least one person in the chat here that really is just opposed to paying for someone to give them updated numbers when they know the numbers are outdated. They don't want to um, recognize that costs have gone up. I was dealing with an association last week that had a reserve study by a firm that clearly hadn't done reserve studies before. It was an engineering firm. They do a lot of engineering, but they hadn't done reserve studies before. So they missed some pretty big components and understated the cost, obviously understated the cost of some of the items, but they were hesitant to do another reserve study because that would mean the news that they would have to present is much worse than what they thought it was. And so people like to have ignorance is bliss, right? Is that what they say? And so unfortunately, yeah, we do see that sometimes, and I couldn't recommend stronger against it. I think again, transparency and being um, honest about the true cost of ownership is what's needed here. But it's hard. It's not easy. I understand the pressure from your neighbors. No one likes to tell people that it costs more to live where it lives. Frankly, there are likely people living in condominiums that are maybe living beyond what they're able to afford just because of the way property values have escalated so far. And I don't know that there is no silver bullet solution. I don't expect our boards to have that solution. This is a wider problem in our society of affordable housing and things. But the truth is, better to know now than to be hit with a special assessment and have to, sell or go into foreclosure or something else, something worse
I think
when the
Matt,
actual expense comes. Yeah.
I actually saw that recently on a project on a property I was working with that, you know, they ignored the fact that they absolutely knew that the replacement cost for their seawall was double what was in their reserve study, and they chose to ignore it. Did not want to update their reserve study. So I see it often as well.
Is there different levels of research studies you could pay for or get? Someone just asked that question here.
Yeah, there are. So there's essentially four levels. Level four is one from plans. Sometimes developers hire us to do them
Okay.
from plans, so I'll leave that one off. But the main three levels are level one is a full reserve study from scratch. So that would be the first time reserve study, level one. Level two is a reserve study update with site visit. And level three would be a reserve study update without site visit, sometimes called a desk update. And usually, if you did a good job on level one, you really only have to do level one first, one time, sorry, and then the level twos and level threes can be done maybe in an alternating method, or some associations just do like a level two every 3 or 4 years or 5 years. Um, yeah, in the cost obviously tier that level one's the most expensive, level two is in between, and level
Okay.
three is the least expensive.
Okay. It's good to know. So I know we're out of time here. I want to give you each, maybe share best practice or last words here before we get off the webinar.
So I'll go first. Starting with our operating budgets. Our operating budgets are actually built on our actual expenses. So please make sure that when you're coding your expenses and you're looking at your financial statements, you're putting everything in the right bucket. If you're just coding to other expense and other income, then you're not getting the data you need to project moving forward. So for operating costs, that's what I would say is the most important thing for in terms of a reserve and special projects, understanding what is meant to be done in this calendar year. Do you have the money to do it? And if it's not, where are we going to get the money? So I think those in parts of budgeting, just understanding and really diving into what the big picture is, and then going in and drilling down on the small components.
Perfect. Thank you, Miriam. Matt?
Good advice. I would say use your partners, use your network, use your team. KW can help you quite a bit with understanding and communicating to your membership. If you have questions, I see some other questions that we didn't get to, but questions about useful lives or incorrect assumptions in reserve studies, go back to that reserve study provider. If you're not happy with the support that you're getting from them, get another opinion. But surround yourself with experts, your attorneys, your CPAs. You don't get paid enough as a board member for those board members that are on the show. You don't get paid anything, right? So you don't take all that liability on yourself. Again, this isn't a personal. It isn't your fault if the fees are going up. Use professionals, use good business judgment because you are running large corporations, and do your best to be responsible and rely on, just like you would if you were running a large corporation. You rely on your legal and your CPA and your engineers and other specialists and your management team to help guide the ship. So thank you for participating. Great questions here today.
Thank you, everyone. If we didn't get to your question, we're going to try to respond to it. We'll get to you via email or send you a note. On behalf of KWPMC and Resident Advisors, thank you everyone for joining us today, and look forward to next month's meeting. We're going to talk about quality of life and wellness in your associations. You're going to love it. Okay, everyone. Have a great day.
Nice. Thank you all.
Take care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.